Picture this, you're mid-call with the state attorney's office, briefing them on municipal corruption like some suburban James Bond, and suddenly, your HOA president and her teenage son storm up your driveway. The son, who can't even pass his driver's test, demands your Harley Davidson for prom night. And mom? She doubles down, suggesting this isn't theft. Oh no, it's community spirit. When you don't cave, she calls the cops on you. That's not just entitlement. That's HOA entitlement turned up to 11. And that, dear viewers, is where our wild ride begins. Today, we're diving into the 10 craziest facts from the saga of HOA Karen versus the Harley. It's a story of power trips, neighborhood politics, and how one Marine veteran turned an HOA battlefield into a courtroom takedown. Let's break it down chapter by chapter. The first absurdity in this saga is the teenage demand that kicked it all off. Now, this wasn't just any motorcycle sitting in the driveway. This was a fully restored heritage Harley Softail, a machine rebuilt bolt by bolt over 3 years, and more importantly, a piece of family legacy. It carried not just chrome and leather, but the memory of a Purple Heart veteran. So imagine the audacity of a 16-year-old who had already crashed multiple cars, walking up and expecting the keys because, hey, sharing builds community. What we see here is entitlement wrapped in suburban smugness. Bradley, the kid in question, represented a dangerous cocktail. Inexperience, ego, and a mother who believed HOA authority trumped private property rights. Why is this important? Because it shows how entitlement thrives when backed by power structures. Bradley wasn't just some brat asking, and the escalation was immediate. A refusal wasn't seen as personal property rights. It was painted as a threat to community spirit. The HOA Karen formula is simple. Take something personal, twist it into a communal issue, then enforce it through intimidation. This little Harley for prom stunt was just the opening move in a much larger chess game, one that was about to spiral out of control. If you thought a teenager demanding a Harley was outrageous, wait until you see how mom weaponized the HOA rulebook like it was her personal sword. Here's where the petty games turn tactical. The HOA president, Connie Thornfield, known locally as the reigning queen of selective enforcement, wasted no time in declaring the Harley a commercial vehicle. Yes, you heard that right. According to her creative reading of Bylaw 7.3b, a motorcycle suddenly equaled running a business out of your garage. This wasn't just inconsistent. It was laughably hypocritical. Neighbors were parking plumbing vans, landscaping trailers, and cars literally covered in business signage, all without issue. Connie's own BMW was decked out with magnetic real estate ads every weekend. But Tank's Harley? That was a problem. This is HOA weaponization at its finest. By twisting the bylaws, Karen wasn't enforcing order. She was targeting selectively. It's the suburban version of lawfare. Bury someone in violations not because they're breaking rules, but because you've decided they're inconvenient. And each violation, that's a $150 fine, plus the psychological warfare of certified letters piling up in your mailbox like mini subpoenas. Here's the genius of her method. Selective enforcement creates plausible deniability. On paper, she wasn't persecuting anyone. She was upholding community standards. But in reality, she was harassing one neighbor into submission while ignoring identical violations elsewhere. That double standard doesn't just erode trust. It builds resentment and fear, the exact climate a petty tyrant thrives in. But fines alone weren't enough. Connie wasn't just flexing her authority. She was building a machine. Fact 3 exposes how this HOA wasn't a community at all. This is where the story jumps from HOA drama to outright corruption. Every bogus fine that Connie dished out wasn't just an annoying fee. It was ammunition. Here's how the scam worked. Fines that went unpaid automatically became liens on the property. And those liens? They could be purchased by Connie's very own shell company at a discount. Yes, you heard correctly. She was manufacturing violations, converting them into liens, then buying those liens herself at 50 cents on the dollar. Once she owned the debt, she could foreclose on properties, then flip them at a tidy profit through her real estate agency. In just 3 years, 8 homes changed hands this way. Each case followed the same playbook. flood the homeowner with violations, watch as the fines stack up, and when they can't afford to fight anymore, swoop in and buy low. This wasn't random HOA squabbling. This was a deliberate strategy, and it turned her HOA presidency into a personal property flipping empire. The brilliance, if we can call it that, lies in how invisible it looked to the average neighbor. Most people see HOA fines as annoying, not existential. They don't realize those small amounts, unpaid, accumulate into financial weapons capable of stripping away entire homes. And this is where the stakes shifted. Tank wasn't just fighting a nosy HOA president. He was up against a structured scam with hundreds of thousands in profit attached. His Harley was just the excuse. The real prize? His property. And when property rights are at stake, things get ugly fast. Which brings us to fact 4, where a midnight break-in turned this HOA feud into a felony waiting to happen. You know, it's bad when the neighborhood conflict shifts from fines to felonies. That's exactly what happened when Tank's security cameras caught the HOA president's teenage son sneaking into his garage at 2 in the morning. The footage was damning. Bradley, fumbling around with a coat hanger, trying to hotwire a Harley like he was in some low-budget heist movie. Only this wasn't Ocean's 11. It was a suburban kid, clueless about motorcycles, managing to tip over the bike and leave scratches across a painstaking restoration job. Here's the chilling part. This wasn't mischief. It was escalation. Tank had been resisting fines, pushing back against HOA harassment, and suddenly his property wasn't just under paper attack. It was under physical attack. Bradley framed it as helping protect the bike, but the reality was clear. This was intimidation through damage. For any normal homeowner, this would be a breaking point. But Tank, with 20 years of Marine discipline behind him, chose not to retaliate in kind. Instead, he documented everything. Photos, videos, timestamps. Because in corruption cases, patience beats fury. The more rope you give bullies, the more they hang themselves. This was the moment the HOA drama stopped being neighborhood politics and started resembling organized crime, with teenage foot soldiers carrying out sabotage missions. But Karen didn't stop there. Because when your own son's antics can't scare a neighbor into compliance, the next step is calling in backup. Fact 5 introduces the enforcer, a code officer with family ties and a clipboard full of bogus authority. Every HOA dictator needs muscle, and in Willowbrook Estates that muscle came with a badge or at least a clipboard. Enter Jim Krotsky, the local code enforcement officer. On the surface, he was just another bureaucrat in cheap cologne. But scratch beneath that, and you find a cozy family tie. His brother had married Connie's sister. Conflict of interest? That's putting it mildly. What happened next was a masterclass in weaponized bureaucracy. After Tank's run-ins with Bradley, Jim showed up at his property with an anonymous complaint. He marched into the garage like a sheriff in a spaghetti western, except instead of bandits, he was hunting for oil stains. Yes, oil stains. According to Jim, a couple of dark spots on the driveway were an environmental hazard. Never mind that every mechanic in America has seen the same thing since the invention of the combustion engine. This was his smoking gun. His way to slap yet another violation on the pile. Here's what makes this sinister. It wasn't about oil. It was about intimidation. The timing, the family connection, the arbitrary enforcement, it all added up to one thing. Collusion. HOA leadership and municipal enforcement weren't separate systems anymore. They were extensions of the same harassment machine. And that's when Tank realized he wasn't dealing with a petty neighbor dispute. He was up against an interconnected web of HOA politics, real estate manipulation, and government officials bending rules for personal gain. In other words, a suburban racket. But as bad as nepotism and bogus citations sound, by this point, Tank wasn't just dealing with petty fines and oil stain harassment. He was staring at a full-blown system, a machine so methodical it looked like it had been engineered in a corporate boardroom. And in a way, it had. The revelation came thanks to a sharp-eyed neighbor, a retired paralegal named Dot Walsh. She'd seen plenty of scams in her years working the legal system, and to her, Connie's pattern wasn't random. It was a blueprint. Here's how the scheme worked in detail. Target selection, elderly residents, single parents, veterans. Basically, people unlikely to have the time, money, or energy to fight back. Violation: flooding grass too long by half an inch. Garbage cans visible for an profit extraction. Enter Connie's real estate agency and her conveniently named shell company. She'd scoop up the debt at discount, force foreclosure, and resell the property for tidy profits. This wasn't HOA management. This was racketeering with manicured lawns as the backdrop. And it wasn't just theoretical. DOT's research uncovered 8 families who'd lost their homes to this exact scheme. Each case played out with military precision. Each ended with Connie's agency pocketing the spoils. Think about the brilliance of this scam. On the surface, it looked like community enforcement. To an outsider, it was just paperwork and rules. But under the surface, it was a conveyor belt. One that converted ordinary homeowners into distressed sellers ripe for flipping. It's the kind of scheme that thrives in the suburbs because it wears the mask of order and rules. Nobody suspects the HOA newsletter about trash can placement is actually the opening chapter of a real estate heist. If the blueprint sounds bad, just wait. Because Connie's son wasn't content being a spoiled bystander. He decided to take a starring role by trying his hand at sabotage. If Bradley's 2 a.m. break-in was the warm-up act, the sabotage attempt was the headliner. This time, it wasn't clumsy theft with a coat hanger. It was calculated, almost chilling in its intent. Security footage captured the teenager sneaking into the garage again, tools in hand. But instead of fumbling with the ignition, he went for the brakes. Loosening the cables, just enough to cause failure later. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to make the motorcycle dangerous on the road. This is where HOA harassment crossed the line into criminal sabotage. It wasn't about property disputes anymore. It was about personal safety. Sabotaging brakes isn't mischievous. It's malicious. And here's the kicker. Bradley wasn't acting in a vacuum. He was echoing the very rhetoric his mother had been feeding him. Remember, Tank was the problem neighbor. The unstable veteran. The outsider hurting community values. When a narrative like that is drilled into a kid, bad decisions follow. What we see here is generational corruption, entitlement taught, modeled, and weaponized. Luckily for Tank, 20 years as a marine mechanic meant nothing mechanical escaped his notice. He spotted the tampering before even turning the key. Instead of blowing up, he documented everything. Fingerprints, photos, video evidence. Every piece carefully logged, waiting for the perfect time to drop the hammer. Bradley's sabotage attempt is critical for one reason. It proved the HOA war wasn't just political. It was criminal conspiracy. And conspiracies, they leave trails. And speaking of trails, Connie wasn't content with physical sabotage. She launched a smear campaign so theatrical it could have earned her a daytime Emmy. When intimidation failed, Connie pivoted to narrative warfare. If she couldn't find Tank into submission, and if her son's sabotage didn't scare him off, she'd try to erase his reputation. The tactics were classic character assassination. Whispering at the mailbox that Tank was unstable. Dropping hints that veterans sometimes snap. Painting every minor disagreement as proof of aggression. This wasn't sloppy gossip. It was strategic. Connie knew perception shapes reality, especially in neighborhoods where property values are the holy grail. By branding Tank as dangerous, she hoped neighbors would isolate him. Once isolated, he'd be easier to crush with fines, liens, and legal maneuvers. But here's where Connie overplayed her hand. Tank wasn't alone. He had allies. Elena, the nurse neighbor, had already seen through the charade. Dot was digging deeper into records. And slowly, the facade of concerned leadership started cracking. HOAs rely on conformity. They thrive when nobody questions the narrative. But once 1 or 2 people poke holes in the story, the whole operation begins to wobble. That's what happened here. Connie's smear campaign planted seeds of doubt, but not against Tank. Against herself. The irony is delicious. In trying to paint Tank as a menace, Connie accidentally spotlighted her own manipulations. And in the age of smartphones, nothing stays secret for long. Recordings, photos, documents. All of it began to pile up, each piece weakening her grip on the narrative. But nothing cracks an empire faster than being caught in 4K. At some point, bullies forget they're being watched. Connie certainly did when she filed a restraining order against Tank, claiming he stalked her, harassed her, and threatened her safety. On paper, it was a convincing affidavit. In court, it crumbled faster than a cheap lawn chair. Why?
Surveillance.
Rico, Tank's Marine buddy, had set up military-grade monitoring equipment. GPS logs, video footage, timestamps, the works. Every single incident Connie described had ironclad proof showing Tank wasn't even there. One supposed stalking incident, he was 200 miles away visiting his aunt. Another claim about threatening her at the grocery store, he was logged in at a meeting with the state attorney. Each incident was the stage was the community center. The audience, practically the entire neighborhood, plus news crews. Connie strutted in, dressed for power, ready to spin one last performance about being the victim. She'd choreographed every move, expecting applause, sympathy, and another round of HOA authority rubber-stamped. What she didn't expect was the counterpunch. Tank rolled out the receipts, literally. Slide after slide exposed her empire. Violation notices stacked in patterns too deliberate to be chance. Financial records showing her shell company flipping foreclosed homes. Audio of her scheming with code enforcement and city council allies. Video evidence of her son's break-ins and sabotage attempts. The room turned electric. Gasps, murmurs, neighbors whispering as the pieces clicked together. Connie tried to shout it down, but the louder she protested, the more damning the evidence looked. And then came the moment every HOA victim dreams of. Detectives stepping forward, cuffs ready. Connie wasn't just humiliated. She was arrested, live, in front of the very neighbors she'd ruled for years. Her allies, taken too. The HOA mafia disbanded in real time. The impact was seismic. Neighbors who'd suffered in silence erupted into applause. Families who'd lost homes to her schemes cried openly. The news footage went viral, turning a local scandal into a national symbol of HOA corruption. In the end, the downfall wasn't about one motorcycle, one veteran, or even one HOA. It was about exposing how entitlement, greed, and unchecked power can rot entire communities. And when that rot finally sees daylight, the empire collapses under its own weight. So what's the takeaway? That HOAs aren't just about lawn care and paint colors. In the wrong hands, they can morph into engines of greed, intimidation, and corruption. But also that they're beatable. Tank's story shows the formula. Document everything, build alliances, and use the system against itself. Bullies thrive in shadows. Shine a light and they fold. Now, here's my challenge to you. What's the craziest HOA story you've ever heard? Drop it in the comments because the more these stories spread, the less power petty tyrants have. And if you enjoyed watching this HOA empire implode, hit that like button, subscribe, and stick around. Because trust me, there are plenty more HOA wars on the horizon.